Bubba's back in charge. So read the first line of the New York Post in describing the appearance of President William Clinton at the White House briefing room just the other day. President Obama brought him in to give a little extra help in persuading Democrats to support his tax reform bill. And the former president came and lent his support, signing on to the approach that President Obama agreed to. In doing that, the President Clinton, that is, continued to talk at some length as the reporters were rather stunned by his appearance and then began to ask him a wide variety of questions, and it was almost as though the President was President again. And what made matters even more surrealistic was when President Obama actually left the briefing room to attend the Christmas party. So President Clinton had the stage all to himself. It was, in the immortal words of Yogi Berra, deja vu all over again. It seemed as though President Clinton was really in charge, in power. Two presidents, one from a past era, a time of prosperity, apparent prosperity at least, and one today in a time of financial crisis, a crisis that perhaps rivals anything that we have faced since the Great Depression. Two eras, two presidents, one in power, one no longer in power. The Christmas season brings us into a similar juxtaposition of two different eras, but they're much further apart, are they not? Our modern age with satellites and television and cell phones and iPads and all the rest of it gives us a very secular view of the world, a very fast-paced world in which we live today. And yet, interrupting this winter season, we have a variety of religious celebrations, one of which is Christmas. A reminder that Jesus Christ came into the world, born of a virgin, in a manger, in a little town called Bethlehem. Shepherds watched their flocks by night, and they heard the glory of angels proclaiming peace on earth among men with whom God is pleased. Quite the odd, almost surreal bringing together of ancient celebrations and the modern world. How do we bring these two together? Is that old story of Bethlehem's birth something that ought to be relegated simply to the mythical past? A story simply designed to marvel and encourage young children with stories of gift-giving and love and a precious child? Or is it something more than that? Does that birth have repercussions for today? And do we really understand the significance of that birth and what impact it has on us today? I thought that we would look today at the Apostle Paul's account of the gospel of God. You know, when you go into the Bible and you begin to open up its pages and you look for the Gospels, you immediately come across Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And at least Matthew and Luke give us rather detailed expositions of the birth of Jesus, birth narratives, his descent from Mary, from Joseph, the wonder of his birth and the events that took place around that birth. Paul does not give us much of any detail at all about the birth of Jesus, though he speaks of the gospel of God. Paul, in fact, when you read through his writings, has very little to say about the earthly life of Jesus. Some modern scholars would even go so far as to suggest that Paul really was not very familiar with the details of Jesus' earthly life and was more consumed with a kind of reinterpretation of that old Jewish rabbi, making him into a Christ figure, a messianic figure, a figure of mythological proportions to inspire people and to motivate them to love and good deeds. The fact of the matter is, however, that the Apostle Paul is quite familiar with the life of Jesus. It just was not his calling to give that account, as you have in Matthew and Luke, and somewhat differently in John's Gospel, where he says, "In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Paul gives us certain glimpses into the life of Jesus in different points in his letters, which show us that he is familiar with the details of Jesus' life, but that was not what was necessary for him to communicate at that time. Recall that he spoke in 1 Corinthians 11 of the Lord's Supper, and he spoke of what was passed on to him, and he gave it to the church, how Christ took the bread and broke it, and so forth. He knew the details of what took place in that upper room. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul also talks about the resurrection of Christ and how Jesus appeared to a wide variety of witnesses, many of whom were yet alive at that very day in which Paul is writing, so that they could add their testimony and certify to the fact that they saw Jesus risen from the dead. Paul knew the details of Jesus' life. But he develops something of the meaning of that life for us in his letters and its implications for the church at large. In particular here in Romans chapter 1, you might look at that text and say, well, where does Paul talk about the birth of Jesus Christ? Where is the Christmas story in this first chapter? And perhaps it's not there in the fullness that you would like, but it is mentioned very briefly. If you look in that first chapter, in the third verse, if I can find it here, he speaks of the gospel regarding his son, who as to his human nature was a descendant of David. Very briefly, Paul speaks to us of the birth of Jesus Christ, recognizing it's not just that he was a descendant of David, but he was born, literally from the Greek, born of the seed of David. And so Paul certifies his own agreement with the account of the Gospels that Jesus was born as a descendant of David, born in the flesh, and not just simply some mystical figure, but a real life individual who entered into this world. But he was no ordinary individual, as Paul will make clear. He was God's Son. And for Paul, that language of him being God's Son is not just simply saying, well, he had something of a spark of divinity in him, much like the rest of us. We all share in the divine being of some form or fashion, and Jesus was God's Son. That's not what Paul has in mind. Quite different. Paul viewed Jesus as the pre-existing Son of God, the eternal member of the Trinity, the second member of the Trinity, set apart from the creation, the Creator over all, who entered into this world, taking on our humanity to accomplish our redemption. Now, you might say you're reading a lot into those opening words about the gospel of God's Son. And perhaps that's more than what those specific words right there will suggest. But certainly when you look through the rest of what Paul has to say, it's apparent that this is what he means when he speaks of Jesus as God's Son. Most especially, you can take a look at Philippians chapter 2, where he speaks of how we ought to share the same mindset that Jesus had, who, being in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of man, and became a servant. And Paul goes on in Philippians 2 to talk about how Jesus left his heavenly realms to enter into this world, taking on our humanity. Paul understood that he was the pre-existing Son of God who entered into this world, born of the seed of David. Now, if you look at what Paul has to say about this Jesus, born of the line of David, the descendant of David, you'll see a couple things here. And I want to emphasize first, well, two things, just very briefly. One, Paul understands Jesus in the light of previous testimonies from Scripture. God has spoken in the Holy Scriptures about this coming Son of David. And the Scriptures explain who he was, how he would come about, how we could recognize him, and what it all would mean. So the birth of Jesus is not something that is left for us to imagine or to apply our own interpretation to. God has sovereignly told us in advance what we are to make of this child's birth. And so our understanding of the birth of Jesus Christ needs to be guided by the Scriptures themselves. We don't simply impose our own interpretation on them and say, this is what it means to me. In our postmodern world, we want to do that, don't we? We have our own narratives that we want to tell, our own stories, and what counts is not an objective meaning that stands over me, but rather my own personal experience of it. And as I have that experience of it, that's what really counts. No, not so. Well, your experience is important, no doubt. But what we have here in Paul's view is God's sovereign, truthful, inspired declaration of who this child was. Paul makes that plain in the second verse. The gospel of God, the first verse, this is what Paul has come to preach. The gospel of God is the gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. Paul looks at the Old Testament Scriptures, what we would consider the law, the prophets, the Psalms, all these writings of the Old Testament. He describes them as the place where we learn about the gospel of Christ. The message that Paul brings about Jesus, then, is not something which is new with him or new with the first century church. They're not introducing a new religion into the world, the religion of Christ, the religion of Jesus. This is not something that's brand new. Rather, Paul is saying that our gospel comes from the Old Testament Scriptures themselves. The Scriptures have told all along what we were to expect with regard to the coming of Jesus and what he would do for us. So, the Christian religion is not a new religion that began with the birth of Christ or with his resurrection, however you understand that, or with the birth of the church. That's not when the Christian religion began. The gospel was proclaimed all the way in the past Scriptures. And Paul could have gone through text after text after text, and he will do that in the book of Romans, explaining the gospel from the Old Testament, the life of Abraham and so forth.